Hello, this is Janae from the Conscious Community Podcast and Conscious Community Magazine. We wanted to let you know that we have sponsorship packages available. If you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, please email Spencer at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com or call or text 630-492-0831. 630-492-0831. Thank you very much for listening. We appreciate all of you. And we are so grateful for your continued support. Please rate, review, and share Conscious Community Podcast with your friends. Thanks again. Now to our episode. Hello, welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast. This episode, we're speaking with Andrew Newman about his books, the Conscious Bedtime Stories Book Club, as well as his life and what brought him to write stories for children. And thank you for coming on and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Janae. It's such a pleasure to be here with you both.
First question would be, what brought you to write stories for bedtime? I did see your TED Talk and you talked about the importance of bedtime and at that moment.
Yes, those last 20 minutes of the day are super, super precious. The stories started coming in a way by themselves. I was simply following my own journaling practice and my own creativity. And I had written a poem and it needed some pictures. That book that you just held up, A Little Light, was the very first story that I wrote. And it was nothing more than a poem that needed some pictures. I thought, because I see the world in images in my mind, that I could show you my world if I put it into a form like this. And I could introduce you to things that I had learned or seen or journeyed or tripped over and recovered from. So that was book one. And the book two was The Fish Who Searched for Water, and book three was the Tree of Goodness, and then all of a sudden I had four because I wrote The Bee Who Could Not Choose Her Flower, and I was like, what am I doing here? Well, who are these books for? Why do I keep writing books? and that's when I held it up against my own therapeutic training and my work as a healer, and could see that there were some narratives coming through me in these stories that were healing and were useful and were missing in the world, and that all of the grown-ups were dealing with problems that started before they were 6 years old. So why not work into this format with kids?
One thing I thought was pretty interesting. I'm pretty infamous for not preparing for our interviews at all. Janae reads most of our guest books cover to cover, and I'll generally flip through the PR person's notes the day of the interview, but I actually sat down and read all of your books, and they're not very intimidating as far as how long they're. One thing that I thought was pretty interesting is that even though they are written, in that children's book simple format, it pretty much lays out the concepts, whether you're talking about prayer or meditation breathing or the healing power of a hug or any of the other ideas that you cover in your books. They're really not that complicated. And there are just book after book after book after book trying to explain some of these philosophical concepts, but you really sum it up nicely in, 500 words. There's not, whether you're an adult or a child, I don't think you really need a big, huge, thick book to explain these things. They're simple concepts.
I mean, these are fairly common human dilemmas that we face at different times. The fish who searched for water, he's out looking for love. It's like we all go looking for love in some way. We all lose sight of the fact that love's right in front of us. Like you mentioned, the hug who got stuck. It's coming out of the hug factory in the middle of the heart and it gets caught on the web of sticky thoughts. Negative self-beliefs. I'm not good enough. Nobody loves me. There's something wrong with me. Now, when our heads are running and those loops on us, then we back away from the world and our flow of love, gets blocked. And I see the world in pictures. And let's make a simple metaphor. Cartoons were always my favorite as a kid. And I'd like these things to be accessible. I'd like them to be spoken about in a way, because they certainly weren't spoken about in my childhood. I wasn't given any narrative on how to be in the world. All of the narrative I got was about preparing me for what I was going to do, what type of a job I was going to have. By a very young age, I was worried about choosing my subjects right so that I got into the right college. And I mean, we're in trouble at that point if we haven't embedded values and morals and foundations, and that those get formed very strongly under the age of 8 years old.
What is your background for those of you who aren't familiar with you? You mentioned that you worked as a healer. What type of modalities? Where do you come from?
Yeah, so at 28 years old, I didn't have a holistic bone in my body. I had lots of tequila, but no personal development focus. And I hit my own crisis point. I left a 4th generation family business, and then I had to go, wait, how do I want to be in the world? Because I wasn't healthy in my relationships. And my first training was with Dr. Barbara Brennan. She's known best for her books, Hands of Light and Light Emerging. And so that's a training in auric field energy healing work, but it's based on the childhood developmental model that recognizes the defenses that we start to form as we're young. I credit that training for the development of my own creativity, because I wasn't creative when I went in the front door, and here we are with 12, 13, 14 kids' books later. And then I went on to study a much more mystical program in a combination of Zen Buddhism and Jewish Kabbalah. And that is the work of non-dual healing created by a teacher called Jason Shulman. So that was my 30s. I got the pleasure of close on 12 years of personal development work, and at the same time doing men's work with the Mankind Project. That to me has been an amazing community that everywhere I travel, I can drop in and sit in circle with a group of men who've all got the same language and the same heart for living lives of integrity and accountability. So those are my 3 big cornerstones of development that I bring into my coaching and counseling work, and then also into the writing.
You mentioned that you come from a background with Kabbalah and Zen. That's an idea that we've kind of touched on with numerous guests. Is I think Rabbi Rami calls it perennial wisdom, that there's these kind of underlying truths between all these mystical traditions that are really much more similar to each other than they are different. So while you have, he calls them branded religions that claim exclusivity from each other, within the mystical traditions, within each of those religions, there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of similarity in the language they use between, Jewish mysticism and Islamic mysticism and Taoism. And there's a lot of common language I've found with like kind of the therapeutic modalities. So I was talking to an acquaintance of mine the other day, and he referred to it as hippie magic. He had a really bad head cold, and he said, "Do you have any hippie magic that could help me?" And I was, it's a really long conversation. I didn't get into it, but I think there's a very there were other cultures that described the things that work that help people heal in different ways that aren't maybe necessarily the Western clinical language, but nonetheless, the concepts they're describing are pretty consistent. That's kind of what I was saying about your books, is that it's not complicated stuff. This is stuff that when I was a kid, don't hit, we learn these things at a very young age if we're not born knowing them. And then we spend 12 years of education unlearning them. And then in our adult life, we have all these kind of maladaptive, painful experiences. And then if we get into some kind of therapy or mystical exploration to try and find answers, we end up going back to what we knew as a child. And that's I almost feel like, to somebody who was looking for answers, they'd be much better off reading your children's books than they would be reading a 600-page self-help.
Is that one of the things you were trying to do with these books? Were you also trying to relate to the parents, so the parents can see their kid learning these things, then they remember, or even that their kid will be like, well, of course, I understand that. And then they're like, oh, and the light goes off in their own head. And, they start to connect to that inner child themselves, as well as with their child's own development.
Yeah, I don't know that I set it out to be a goal, but I do see it happening. And it's quite interesting, because this feels like, whilst it's my work, it's also a spiritual body of work that's coming through me that I don't yet fully understand its own impact, and that I'm learning and I'm seeing that as I put things out in the world. So I see this happening, that it's a resource for parents and teachers to communicate some of their internal world that they may not yet have. They didn't get 10 years to just focus on personal development. They jumped into life, and maybe they were parents in their early 20s, or whatever their journey's been. My journey's got had this kind of bracketing, or this ring fence where I got to do all this inquiry work, and so I can see that the books have become an asset in between supporting parents who haven't yet done that. But just like you were saying a minute ago, Spencer, they fall back into the innocence of their own childhood and the remembrance. And this is what I loved your summary. It's exactly how I experienced my own personal development, creative journey, that at the healing path that I unlearned, and I found myself back where I started in my innocence. And I mean, the starting words on your mission statement are to unify. That's the first thing you say. And I mean, this is right. We want to create a unified human experience, regardless of the different languages. We're pointing towards the same thing, this state of oneness, whether we talk about it as oneness or we talk about it as reality, we talk about it as God. Those are different languages and pathways, but what we're pointing to is ultimately, for me, the same unified field of consciousness out of which we arise, and through that expresses through us.
You mentioned finding your own creativity as part of your healing process. Do you feel that we just talked to, it was a while ago now, but we just released a podcast with Mikkel Vega, who runs a group called Vital Warrior, and they work with veterans and first responders and their families with PTSD. And he really encourages people to get in touch with their creative side to heal that. And it just seems to be such a universal idea that you have to go back to your creativity. That's like your power. Our inner power is our creativity. And when you're not cultivating that creativity, it's like someone's stealing your power from you. That's one thing I think, like, just by writing stories, by drawing pictures, even by encouraging other people to write children's books, or you're just encouraging people to get back their power, and they can start from a very basic place.
It is a form of power. I haven't thought of it or spoken about it that way, but Barbara Brennan used to talk about the creative cycle, and how our first creative impulse emerges from almost this nothingness, this deep nothingness, that like black holes and galaxies type of nothingness. And there's this impulse to create something. Now, whether that's a book, a poem, a meal, a spreadsheet, a song, these are all, it's all the same journey, that this impulse comes from nothing. It goes out into the world, and then there's this expansion that happens, which gets to a point where there's a pause and we reach the stasis. And that's like this moment of me going, here's my book. And now the world must respond. It will respond. Must isn't quite the right word. The world will respond. And that response I need to then take back, and it's got to come all the way back into me. So I get to see and feel, what's it like for you to have read one of my stories, and you say, I loved it, or I didn't like this, or this thing confused me, or I really felt identified with this character. And all of that is the return inside of me of my own creative pulse. And it goes all the way back into that sacred nothingness, in a certain way, in preparation for another impulse. And of course, this is happening on a microscopic level and a macroscopic level all the time for all of us. When we start to inhibit our own natural impulse, then our essence isn't being fully expressed, and that will lead to issues of health, issues of mental confusion, feeling lack of belonging, feeling like we don't have a place in the world, because we're not connected to that divine emergence. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh yeah.
One thing I thought of, and I was curious where you have seen the reception from your books. Are they getting out to teachers or schools? Is it more like private schools or public school teachers, or what communities have shown receptivity to them? Because one thing I've seen that's somewhat concerning is that when you have people who are very entrenched in like a branded religion, they sometimes react very strongly to something like a book, like one of your books mentions casting spells and kind of like more of like a Wiccan type perspective. And then there's another one that talks about prayer, and there's there's meditation. That for some people there are some people who are in religious traditions that regard stuff like meditation as dangerous or witchcraft. I was curious, like, are you seeing your books make it into public schools, or has there been any kind of pushback from parents like that, or what's been your experience with that?
Well, the book that you're referring to, the Wiccan stuff, is The Laughing Witch, and then the other one, The Prayer Who Searched for God. Now, in the greatest of ironies, the public school sector, I hear from some teachers, but not all, so it depends on the school, that they can't use The Prayer Who Searched for God, but they don't have any problem with The Laughing Witch. So, and because, again, The Laughing Witch comes around as a seasonal Halloween thing, it goes, works very well in October. And yes, she invokes the 7 directions, and she calls on the ancestors, and she connects with her heart, and she casts spells. And but she is a kind, loving, beautiful woman in the world. And witches have a terrible reputation. And I wanted to work a little bit against that reputation to encourage the natural curiosity of the interrelationship with nature, because that's what I see, women working in this way have, particularly women. To answer your question, we're a huge hit in the Montessori community. We're also very closely tied in with Dr. Becky Bailey's work, which is called Conscious Discipline. She has an incredible body of work that's been running for 20 years, and some of the best adult-child engagement methodologies that I've ever come across. So skillful. And recently I was very excited to read The Hug Who Got Stuck to 1,000 teachers at her conference, and we had a big hug fest. Everybody got connected. And so I'm finding that the language that I didn't think anybody else was speaking about, that's not true. It's already being spoken about and developed in certain ways. And so we're finding our affiliations. America is really leading the mindfulness and education development. Obviously, we see more of that in the West Coast, but certainly not only. And there's these wonderful pockets all around the country of pioneering teachers who are bringing their own experiences into their school environment and leading this narrative for healthy engagement with kids. Mm-hmm. Beautiful to see.
That's really good to hear. Yeah. Everything's kind of colored through the lens of my own personal experiences, but it's only been really in the last year or so that I've been involved with the podcast that I've started to meet other people of like mind who are authors and working in this general subject area. And for most of my life, I have lived in places where it was like looking at you sideways. What kind of weird stuff is that about? Because I've been into Taoism and meditation and all kinds of esoterica since I was a kid. And in my family, it was normal, but I was always, in a small town America spot where we were the weird people. It's really kind of exciting to me to see it kind of reach more broad mainstream acceptance.
It really has here in the Midwest in the last 20 years, I would say. I grew up in this town where we live, and it used to be, no, you didn't. Meditation in schools, I remember parents being like, can't introduce that Satanism in our schools. They didn't want it. But now this town is full of New Age bookstores.
Yeah, they've got a crystal shop downtown.
Yeah, so it's interesting. And the churches around here, even the traditional churches, they all have the gay pride flag out front, and it's totally changing. There's a lot more unity, even here in the Midwest.
And I really don't. That's another thing I was thinking when we were talking about. Like, I don't see any contradiction between hard science and your witch story and your prayer story. Like, for me, it's all the same thing, and it's different ways of explaining the same experience of being in the universe. And that's not that one is right and one is wrong. Like, they're all right in their own way. kind of is how I think about it. So I really appreciated that you kind of hit different traditions within your same series.
Was that intentional, or did it happen organically?
That's a great question. There's a lot of organic here. And I mean, if I tell you a little bit about my writing process, you'll understand that. So I'm just minding my own business, doing what I do. And one of the things that I do is I meditate. So I go off to a 4-day silent retreat because it's something that I want for myself. I have no intention of writing a book. I haven't even thought that I might write a book. I've just gone to meditate. And at the end of that, there's this little knock, knock, knock on the inside of my head, which has become familiar. And it's like, go and get your pen. And I go and get my pen and I write. And in 5 minutes, I've written a story. And that becomes The Boy Who Searched for Silence. So to say it's intentional would be a slightly misnomer, but my life is intentional. And the direction that I've taken my life to be in service, to be a healing presence in the world, and to share what it is that I've been fortunate enough to learn, is very intentional. And then Spirit works through me. And some of the stories are written out of really beautiful, easy moments, like the one you just described. Some of them that'll be coming down the line are actually written out of really challenging interrelational moments where the tiger comes out of me and I behave a little bit dramatically, and then, as one does when we're in our triggered state and our survival brain, and then the next day I get to reflect on my own behavior and go, wow, that was a little bit crazy. Perhaps I can write a story about how to not be so crazy. Because I think it's pretty normal for us to all hit that crazy button sometimes, and then to have to do the work of repair. So I also want to be able to educate around how do we do relational repair? What does that look like when things have gotten fractured?
When you originally started to write the series, did you see it as a series, or did you just write a book and you're like, I got to get this out somehow? I want to. And then all of a sudden you realized you had a series, or had you written several stories and then like, oh, they all should come out together?
Yeah, after the fourth book was out, I went off to the Frankfurt Book Fair. It has 8 football stadiums full of publishers and writers and agents and all sorts of things. And at that point, I went and did a little self-inquiry and some strategy work. And I could see both intuitively and practically that this was a series. And at that stage, I started to do what was necessary with brand development, with book cover development, to say, hold on, we want these to be coherent on the bookshelf.
They're very well done in that respect. It's all very unified.
And you have various illustrators too. There's more than one illustrator.
Yeah, but they all feel like part of a series. It didn't feel haphazard at all. Which did you publish the first 4 in like an earlier format and then republish them as part of the branded set, or?
Yes, exactly. The first 4 were just done in paperback. We didn't have the stickers integrated, and I mean, I love that little star counter at the back of the book. So when the parents said to me, I can't tell you how many times I've read Thomas the Tank Engine. And so I thought, well, you should count, And so we got this little star counter where you can peel off a star sticker and stick it on the back. And then, you know how many times you've read the book. And it gives you another point of connection and the shared activity with the little ones. At those last 20 minutes of the day, kids do the darndest stuff. They open right up. Because you're no longer sort of face to face with them in a parenting role, but you're side by side with them, entering this mystical world of story, and it somehow opens up a permissioning and a spaciousness for them to start talking about the difficult things that happen to them in their day, or their big questions that they're carrying about life. And yeah, it's nice to be a part of that.
That was, I think, when it comes to reflecting on my own childhood, and I had many positive experiences and many negative ones, but I think the single most formative thing that I experienced as a child from all of my parents, and I had parents and step parents. They all read at bedtime to all of us kids, and that was, I think that helped me develop linguistically at a very young age. You know, I was reading before I was 2 years old. Like these are things that when I tell people, they're like, "Oh no, that's impossible," and it's like, no, I think that's pretty normal if you just read read bedtime stories to your kids, and it's such a simple.
Developmentally, it's really important. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's you know, I think that has way more to do with how I am who I am today than where I went to college or books I've read as an adult.
So I got a couple of comments around that. First, Dr. Becky Bailey makes this fabulous point. She says, it's not about the book you're reading, it's about the lap you're sitting on. You know, that doesn't help me sell books, but my collection is about connection, right? And it's about the value of that connection. And that's why there's a breathing practice in the start of each story. It's why there's these reflection pages at the end, so that there can be a deepening of contact between parent or grandparent and child. And then it surprises me, but it's so important that it surprises me. I meet parents when I'm out at public events, so not when I'm at the kind of the teaching events, but public events, and I'll settle in. They'll come past with a pram, and I'd like to read a kid a book, and then there's still always a parent who goes, "Oh, I don't read to her. She doesn't read yet. She's too young." And I kind of take a breath and go, "Okay, wow."
There's no too young.
there's no too young. There's no too young. Yeah.
Babies respond to hearing their parents' voices. I mean, just the act of doing that, and the brain is so developing. You're learning so fast when you're a child.
I had another parent tell me at one point that it was bad to teach your kid to read before kindergarten, because kindergarten is where you learn your ABCs, and you don't want them to be too far ahead of the other kids.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, no, that's not how it works. Yeah, there's no too soon to learn how to read. I think that's and I would love to see some scientific research on this, because I've never actually seen it, but I have very clear, vivid memories before the age of 2. And people often say that their earliest memories are 3, 4, 5 years old. I think there's some kind of connection there between having the words to relate your narrative and being able to remember it. I was very, very, very verbal when I was really, really young. And I can remember, I remember my little brother being born, and I wasn't even 2 years old when he was born. You know, I remember the day I was born. I remember the scarf I was wearing. I remember very clearly. And I think that is very attributable to having the words to remember it. And I think I got that from bedtime stories. You know, that's that you're seeing a picture, you're hearing the words, you're seeing the words, it's being related to you by your parent. It's just a very powerful experience for kids.
I know I'm in love with Dr. Becky Bailey, but another one of her beautiful quotes is that my external language becomes your internal language. Mm-hmm. That's why we want to be able to offer, taking our breath and pausing and not blowing up, and when we're a little bit triggered by their own action, because the kindness and the modeling that's in that becomes the kindness and the modeling that kids grow up to be. And the story can do this. Story can offer that modeling. And just like you're saying, you're picking that up before you're even 2 years old, because the character in the story is kind, because the character in the story goes through a struggle but has a personal victory. All of that goes right in, and the kids end up with an internal language that has them feeling safe, loved, and belonging, from which they can begin to behave that way and communicate that way.
We did want to give you a chance to share with our audience any ongoing projects that you have.
And let them know where they can find the book club, and
then any other links or projects that you're working on.
No, thank you. Our home site is consciousstories.com. And that will always have pointers off to all the other places. But if one's keen, we do books one at a time, or we do a book of the month club for families who want to journey with us for a year. And that's only available through consciousstories.com. The titles are also available on Amazon, but the most exciting thing happening right now for us is the launch of our 2 new titles. Those are called The Girl with Waterfall Eyes and a book called We Are Circle People. And both of those are launching right now on Kickstarter. Again, details can be found for the links on consciousstories.com. The Girl with Waterfall Eyes, I'm so in love with it. It's this mythical fantasy tale of this girl who helps keep and regulate the balance of the world. And as night comes and things get dark, she loses her balance and she falls off the planet. And no spoiler alerts, you'll have to see what happens there. And we are circle people. Well, that's a little bit of a reminder. It's a rally cry and a reminder that says when we can sit close enough together to bump knees and close enough together to hear and feel each other's heartbeats, then there's a real sense of connection and safety and love and belonging. And that's what I'm about in my personal world and in the world of these stories, in creating those experiences. So I would love for folk to come and check us out on Kickstarter, social media, Instagram and Facebook under Conscious Bedtime Stories.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and we'll let you know when everything comes out.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank you, and Monica, for coming on. So thanks.
Thanks for your beautiful work and keeping the flag going for consciousness out in the world.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Conscious Community Podcast. If you'd like more information about sponsoring this podcast or advertising with Conscious Community Magazine, in print or online, please email me at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com. That's SPENCER, or call 630-492-0831.